The end of the hall. Apartment 4F was the last door. This was not a metaphor or an approximation. It was a physical fact of the building's layout that the woman who lived in 4F had been aware of since the day she moved in 3 years ago, and that she had, over those 3 years, come to think of as a feature rather than a flaw. There was something clarifying about being at the end. About knowing that every sound in the hallway outside your door was moving toward you or away from you, that there was no ambiguity of origin, no question of whether the footsteps you heard at 2 in the morning were passing or arriving. At the end of a hallway, sounds have a destination. The woman who lived in 4F was named June Walcott. She was 31 years old, and she had lived alone in the apartment since the end of a relationship that had ended the way most relationships end in your late 20s. Not dramatically, but definitively, with the slow mutual recognition that the thing between two people had run its course, and that staying was a kindness to neither of them. Her ex-boyfriend's name was Marcus, and he had been good about the leaving, and she had been good about it too, and they had not spoken in 14 months, and she thought about him occasionally in the way you think about someone who was important and is now simply past. She worked as a copy editor for a mid-sized publishing house in downtown Chicago. She worked from home 3 days a week and went into the office too, and her days had the quiet, productive rhythm of someone who had built a life that fit them well. She had friends she saw regularly. She ran along the lakefront on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. She cooked seriously and ate well and read more than anyone she knew, and was, by every available measure, a person who had arranged her life into something she could be comfortable inside. The building was a 6-story prewar on the north side of Chicago in a neighborhood called Andersonville. It had 12 units, 2 per floor, and a self-service elevator that made a specific sound on each floor, a brief mechanical exhalation that June could hear from her apartment when the building was quiet. The hallway outside her door was approximately 40 feet long, running from the elevator lobby at the west end to her door at the east end, with the door of apartment 4E on the left side about halfway down. 4E was occupied by a couple named the Brennans, David and Sue, who were pleasant and quiet, and whom June had dinner with 3 or 4 times a year. June knew her hallway. She knew every sound it made, and every sound that moved through it, and she had known these things for 3 years. And she had developed the specific fluency with a building's acoustics that people who live alone in old buildings develop. The ability to distinguish the elevator from the stairs, to know when the Brennans were home versus away, based on the sounds that transmitted through the shared wall, to identify the particular resonance of footsteps on the hallway floor based on weight and pace. She knew her hallway, which is why, on the night of February 3rd, when she heard someone running through it, she knew immediately that what she was hearing was wrong. It was 11:40 on a Tuesday night. June was in bed, not asleep, reading, her lamp on, the rest of the apartment dark. She was in the state of good tired that comes at the end of a productive day, the kind of tired that makes a book feel like a reward rather than an obligation. The building was quiet around her in the way it was quiet after 10 on weeknights, the elevator inactive, the other tenants settled, the particular compressed silence of a pre-war building with thick walls and heavy doors holding the world at a very comfortable distance. She heard the elevator exhale on 4. She noted it without looking up from her book. Someone coming home late, normal. She heard the elevator doors open and the brief mechanical pause before they closed again. She heard footsteps in the hallway, coming from the elevator lobby toward the east end. Normal pace, normal weight, the footsteps of someone walking to their door. The Brennans or someone visiting them, she noted, because 4E was the only door between the elevator lobby and her own door, and if the footsteps continued past 4E, they would have nowhere to go. The footsteps passed 4E. June looked up from her book. The footsteps continued, past the point where 4E's door was, past the midpoint of the hallway, coming toward the east end, coming toward her door. She sat up in bed, put the book down, looked at her bedroom door, which was open, beyond which the short hall to the front door was visible in the ambient light of the apartment. The footsteps reached her door and stopped. She sat in her bed and she looked at the front door and she waited. The footsteps had stopped directly outside 4F, directly outside her door. She waited for the knock that the footsteps suggested was coming, the neighbor who needed something, the building super with some late notification, any of the ordinary explanations for footsteps that stop outside your door at 11:40 on a Tuesday. No knock came. She waited 30 seconds, 45, a minute. Nothing. She got up and went to the front door, and she looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. 40 feet of empty hallway lit by the overhead fixtures, the door of 4E closed, the elevator lobby visible at the far end, everything exactly as it should be at 11:40 on a Tuesday. No one was there. June stood at the peephole for a moment. Then she unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door and looked out at the hallway directly. Empty. She looked toward the elevator lobby and toward the stairwell door at the west end, and neither was in motion. She closed the door and locked it and stood in her entryway for a moment. Then she went back to bed and she picked up her book and she told herself what she told herself, which was the elevator had exhaled on 4, but the person had been going to 5, and the stairs were at the west end of the hallway, and what she had heard was someone walking from the elevator to the stairwell, and the footsteps had stopped outside 4F, because she had misjudged the distance in the way that you sometimes misjudge distance in acoustic spaces you know well. The familiar becoming misleading precisely because of its familiarity. She told herself this, and she believed it adequately, and she read for another 20 minutes and turned her light off and slept. On February 5th, a Thursday, she heard it again. Same time, 11:43. She was already in bed, light on, book in hand, and she heard the elevator exhale on 4, and she heard the footsteps come out of the lobby, and she did not look up from the book because footsteps in a hallway at 11:43 were not something that required her attention. The footsteps passed 4E. She looked up. They came to her door and stopped. She sat in the same stillness as 2 nights before, looking at the front door, waiting for the knock. No knock. She waited longer this time, 2 full minutes, before she got up and looked through the peephole. Empty hallway. She stood at the peephole for a longer moment this time, and then she opened the door and stood in the doorway and looked both directions down the hall. Empty. The elevator was on the ground floor, indicated by the floor display above the elevator doors at the lobby end. The stairwell door was closed. She looked at the floor of the hallway. The hallway had old linoleum tile, the kind that accumulated scuffs and marks from 30 years of tenants' shoes, and she looked at the floor in front of her door in the overhead light. She was not certain what she was looking for. She did not find anything that told her anything. She went back inside. She called her friend Nora, who was still awake because Nora was always still awake at 11:43. She told Nora what she had heard. Nora asked if it had happened before. June told her about Tuesday. Nora was quiet for a moment, and then said it was probably the building settling, that old buildings made sounds that mimicked footsteps, that she had experienced this in her apartment in Wicker Park, and had been convinced for 2 weeks that someone was walking through her living room at night before she identified it as the radiator pipes. June said she knew the difference between a radiator pipe and footsteps in a hallway. Nora said she believed her. They talked for another 20 minutes, and then June went to sleep, and the building was quiet, and she slept without interruption. And in the morning, the hallway outside her door was the hallway outside her door, ordinary and still. And she went for her Thursday run along the lakefront and felt the February cold on her face and thought about the footsteps and could not find a framework for them that felt complete. On February 7th, she bought a doorbell camera. She installed it herself, which took 40 minutes and 1 YouTube tutorial, and a level of focus that she brought to it specifically because having something to do about a problem was better than not having something to do about it. The camera was small, positioned at the top of the door frame. covering the hallway outside 4F in both directions. She set the motion sensitivity, and she set the alert to her phone, and she checked the field of view on the app, and it was good, covering the full width of the hallway from her door to approximately 10 feet in each direction. That night, Wednesday, she heard nothing. She slept through the night without the elevator exhaling on 4 and without footsteps in the hallway, and she woke refreshed and slightly embarrassed by the camera she had installed, and slightly less embarrassed than she would have been if it had not been the second occurrence. Thursday night, nothing. Friday night, she went to dinner with Nora and came home at midnight and checked the camera footage from the evening out of habit, and there was nothing on it, and she went to bed. Saturday, she slept late and read in bed and made a slow breakfast and spent the afternoon on a manuscript she was editing. And at 10 in the evening, she texted David Brennan and asked, as casually as she could construct the question, whether he had been aware of any unusual sounds in the 4th floor hallway in the past week. David responded in 5 minutes. He said actually yes, that Sue had mentioned hearing what she described as running in the hallway on a couple of occasions in the past week or so, late at night, and that they had assumed it was someone in the building and had not thought much of it. He asked if everything was okay. June said yes. She was just checking. She had heard some things too. She stared at his response for a moment. Then she called him. David answered, and she asked him to tell her exactly what Sue had described. David relayed the question to Sue, who was in the room, and then came back and said Sue described it as the sound of someone running in the hallway, not walking, running, past their door and continuing east and stopping. She said it had happened 3 times that she had been awake for. June said, running. David said, that's what she said. Why? What did you hear? June said she had heard footsteps stopping outside her door. She had not heard running. There was a pause. Then David said he was going to go look at the hallway. June heard him get up and heard the sound of their door opening and 20 seconds of silence, and then David came back and said the hallway was empty. June thanked him and said goodnight and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about the difference between what she had heard and what Sue had heard. Sue had heard running, past 4E and continuing east. June had heard footsteps stopping outside 4F. These were not the same sound. These were not the same event being described differently by 2 people. These were 2 different auditory experiences occurring in the same location and in the same general time frame, and they did not match. Something ran past 4E and did not stop. Something stopped outside 4F. On Sunday morning, June reviewed the camera footage from the previous week. All of it, beginning from the night she installed the camera, working forward. Nothing on Wednesday, nothing on Thursday, nothing on Friday. Saturday, her own departure at 7 in the evening and her return at midnight. Nothing after that. She went back further. She went to Tuesday, February 3rd, the first night. The camera had not been installed on February 3rd, and there was no footage. She went to February 5th, the second night. The camera had not been installed on February 5th, and there was no footage. She had installed the camera on February 7th, and since February 7th, there had been nothing on it. She sat with this. She sat with the specific frustration of a situation in which the evidence collection had begun precisely when the events had stopped, and she understood that this was either coincidence or it was not coincidence. And if it was not coincidence, then it meant something that she did not want to think about directly. It meant that whatever was in the hallway knew the camera was there. She told herself this was not a thought she was going to entertain, because entertaining it required accepting a premise that she was not prepared to accept, which was that the thing producing the sounds in her hallway was capable of identifying a change in the environment and responding to it. She did not entertain the thought. She went for a run. On February 12th, a Thursday, she heard the running. Not footsteps this time. Running. What Sue had described. The sound of someone running in the hallway at full speed, the impact of feet on linoleum tile at a pace that was not walking and was not jogging but was running, The way you run when you are going somewhere urgently or away from something urgently. She heard it at 11:51, and she was out of bed, and at the front door in 4 seconds, and she had the deadbolt turned, and the door open before the running had fully stopped, and she was in the doorway of 4F looking down the 40-foot hallway before the sound had finished. The hallway was empty. She was standing in the open doorway of 4F looking at an empty hallway, and she had heard running that had gone the length of the hallway and had taken perhaps 3 seconds, and she had opened her door in 4 seconds and the hallway was empty. She looked at the camera on the door frame above her head. The camera's indicator light was on. It was recording. She went back inside and she pulled up the app on her phone and she went to the live feed and she looked at the hallway on the screen. Empty hallway. She went to the footage from the motion event that had just triggered. The app indicated a motion event at 11:51, which was when she had opened the door, triggered by her own motion. Before that, no motion event, no footage of anything in the hallway before she opened the door. The camera had not captured the running. June stood in her kitchen in the dark and she looked at the app and she thought about what a motion-activated camera does when something triggers it, which is begin recording. She thought about the sensitivity setting she had selected, which was medium, and about whether something could move through a hallway without triggering a motion sensor. She thought about what kind of something that would be. She changed the sensitivity to maximum. She checked the field of view again, and it was the same, 10 feet in either direction from her door. She put the phone down and she looked at the front door and she looked at the deadbolt and she turned it. Then she unlocked it. She was not going to tell you she was not afraid because she was afraid in the specific way of someone who has been hearing something for 10 days and has been in the doorway of the hallway 4 times and has found nothing and who has a camera that is not capturing anything and who is running out of explanations that hold. She was afraid. She unlocked the deadbolt anyway because the alternative was to spend the rest of the night in her apartment with the deadbolt turned and the covers pulled up, and whatever was in the hallway outside her door was going to continue to be in the hallway outside her door regardless of whether the deadbolt was turned, and she needed to understand it. She opened the door. She stepped into the hallway. The hallway was lit the way it was always lit, the overhead fixtures at intervals, the floor 40 feet of old linoleum tile, the door of 4E on the left, the elevator lobby at the west end, her door at the east end behind her. She stood in the hallway, and she looked west toward the elevator lobby, and she looked east at her own door behind her, and she turned around and looked at the wall. The east end of the hallway was a wall. Her door was the last door, 4F, and beyond her door the hallway terminated in a wall. A flat plaster wall, the same aged off-white as the rest of the hallway walls with nothing on it. The end of the hall. June stood in the hallway and she looked at the wall at the east end and she looked at her door and she thought about the running. About something running from the elevator lobby east at full speed. About the 40 feet of hallway. About the end of it. About what happens when something runs at full speed toward a wall. She walked to the east end. She stood in front of the wall. She put her hand on it. Plaster over lath, solid, the wall of an 80-year-old building. She pressed on it. It was a wall. She looked at the floor in front of the wall in the overhead light. The old linoleum tile, scuffed and marked. She looked at the baseboard where the wall met the floor. She crouched down and she looked at the baseboard. There was a gap. Not a large gap, not the gap of a door or an opening. A gap of perhaps a 1/4 inch between the baseboard and the floor, which was not unusual in an old building where the floors had settled and the baseboard had not settled with them. Except that along the length of this baseboard, the gap was not consistent. In the center section, approximately 2 feet of it, the gap was wider, perhaps 3/4 of an inch. And in the linoleum tile in front of this section, there were marks that were not the random scuffs of 30 years of tenant shoes. They were marks made by something pressing against the baseboard repeatedly. The linoleum was marked with a pattern of compression that was consistent with something pressing against the wall from the hallway side, low, near the floor, repeatedly. The marks were recent enough that the linoleum had not fully recovered its shape. June stood up. She went back to her apartment, and she got her phone, and she called her building's management line, and she got the after-hours voicemail, and she left a message about the east hallway wall on the 4th floor, and the gap in the baseboard and the marks on the floor, and she asked them to call her first thing Monday morning. Then she stood in her apartment, and she looked at the door to the hallway, and she thought about what she had found and what it meant. Something ran the length of the 40-foot hallway and hit the east wall. Not stopped outside her door, hit the east wall, repeatedly, hard enough to compress the linoleum over time. She pulled up the building's records on her phone, the tenant portal where the floor plans were stored. She pulled up the 4th floor plan and she looked at it. The hallway on the east side of the building, 4E on the left, 4F at the end, and beyond 4F on the east side of the building, according to the floor plan. A unit. Not a wall, a unit. According to the original floor plan of the building, there was a 3rd unit on the 4th floor on the east side of the building. The floor plan labeled it 4G. She had lived in this building for 3 years, and she had never seen a door for 4G. She had never been aware of a 4G. The hallway ended at her door, and the wall beyond it, and she had never had any reason to think there was anything beyond the wall. She looked at the floor plan again. 4G was there. On the east side of the 4th floor, beyond 4F, accessible from the hallway. Accessible from a door that was not there. She called David Acaffer Brennan at midnight. She apologized for the hour. She told him what she had found. She asked him if he had ever heard of a unit 4G. David was quiet for a moment, and then said he hadn't, that as far as he knew the 4th floor had 2 units. She asked him if he knew anything about the building's history. He said not much, that he and Sue had been there 4 years, and the management company had been managing it for the entire time, and he had never had cause to look into the building's history beyond what was relevant to his lease. June thanked him and hung up, and she searched the building's address in the Cook County property records, which are public, and which she accessed from her phone sitting on her kitchen floor at 12:30 in the morning. She found the building's records, and she found the unit history, and she read through it, and she found what she was looking for in the records from 11 years ago. Unit 4G had been decommissioned. The word used in the record was decommissioned, which she had not encountered in a property record before, and which she searched in the context of residential units. The record indicated that Unit 4G had been decommissioned following an incident that the record described in the bureaucratic language of property management as a matter of record with the Chicago PD, case number included, and that the unit had been sealed and incorporated into the building's structural space following the decommissioning. The door to 4G had been sealed, plastered over, made into a wall. She searched the case number. It took her 20 minutes to find a reference to it in a digitized Chicago Tribune archive from 11 years ago. The article was brief and placed in the city section, the kind of article that ran once and was not followed up on. A paragraph and a half about a man named Robert Creel who had lived in Unit 4G of a building on the north side, and who had been found in his unit by building management following a welfare check requested by tenants on the 4th floor who had reported hearing running in the hallway at night, repeatedly, for several weeks, running that stopped at the east end of the hall. Robert Creel had been dead for approximately 3 weeks when they found him. The article said he had no next of kin. It said the unit had been sealed after the discovery. It said the building management had declined to comment on the timeline of events that had led to the welfare check being delayed. June sat on her kitchen floor with her phone in her hands, and she read the article twice. She thought about the running, about the sound of it, full speed, the length of the hallway, stopping at the east end. She thought about what Sue had heard, past 4E and east, and what she had heard, stopping outside 4F, and she thought about the difference between those two descriptions, and about the wall between 4F and 4G, and about how thin a plaster wall is, and about what someone on the other side of a plaster wall might sound like when they were trying to get through it. She thought about the camera that had recorded nothing. She thought about the motion sensor that had not triggered. She thought about the marks in the linoleum in front of the baseboard. The compression pattern, made over time, low near the floor, the marks of something pressing against the wall from the hallway side repeatedly. Or from the other side. She thought about the date on the article. 11 years ago. She thought about what 11 years in a sealed unit meant in terms of what was in there and what condition it was in. And she stopped thinking about that because there were limits to what she was going to think about at 12:45 on a Thursday morning, sitting on her kitchen floor. She called 911. The Chicago PD sent 2 officers. They came within 15 minutes, and June showed them the marks in the linoleum and the gap in the baseboard and the floor plan on her phone and the article on her phone and the case number, and the officers looked at all of it and looked at each other and called it in. A building inspector came the following morning with a representative from the management company and 2 officers. They brought equipment. They measured the east wall of the 4th floor hallway, and they compared the measurements to the floor plan, and they confirmed the discrepancy, the space between the end of the hallway and the exterior of the building that the floor plan indicated was Unit 4G. They opened the wall. Not dramatically, with a saw and a crowbar, carefully, the way you open a wall when you are trying to preserve the integrity of what's behind it for documentation purposes. They cut a section of the plaster and the lath behind it, and they opened it. There was a door behind the wall. The original door to 4G, sealed in place, the knob removed, the frame plastered over from the hallway side. When the plaster was removed, the door was there, its paint original, its hardware gone, a rectangle of old wood that had been made into a wall and had been a wall for 11 years. They opened the door. June was not allowed inside. She stood in the hallway while the officers and the inspector went in, and she stood there for a long time. David and Sue Brennan came out of 4E and stood with her. None of them spoke. One of the officers came out after 20 minutes. He spoke to June quietly. He told her the unit was, as the records indicated, a 1-bedroom apartment, sealed for 11 years. He told her the unit contained the personal effects of the previous tenant in the state they had been in when the unit was sealed. He told her there was nothing in the unit that constituted an active threat or an immediate concern. He paused. June asked him what else. He said there were marks on the inside of the door. On the interior surface of the door to 4G, at approximately waist height, there were marks consistent with impact. The door had been struck from the inside, repeatedly, over a period of time, hard enough to leave impressions in the wood. He said the forensic assessment would take time, and he could not tell her more than that at this point. He said there was one more thing. He said that below the impact marks on the inside of the door, near the floor, there was a gap between the bottom of the door and the door frame. A gap of perhaps an inch, old and settled. And in the linoleum on the inside of the door, on the 4G side, there were marks. The same compression pattern as the marks on the hallway side, low near the floor. The marks of something pressing against the door repeatedly. From the inside. For a long time. June Walcott moved out of apartment 4F 6 weeks later. Not immediately. Not in the panicked overnight departure of someone who cannot stay another moment. She gave her notice properly, and she packed her things over the course of 3 weeks, and she moved to an apartment in Lincoln Square in a building that was new construction, poured concrete, no history, no sealed units, no doors behind walls. She thought about 4G sometimes, about Robert Creel, who had no next of kin and who had been in the unit for 3 weeks before anyone came, about the marks on the inside of the door, about what it means when a door cannot be opened from the inside and you need it to open and you hit it and then you try something else. You get down low. You find the gap at the bottom. You press against it. You try to get through. She thought about the camera that had recorded nothing, about the motion sensor that had not triggered, about what kind of thing moves through a hallway without triggering a camera. She thought about the running. Full speed, 40 feet of hallway, the east wall, every night for weeks. The same hallway that Robert Creel had walked when he was alive. The same east end where his door had been, behind the plaster, the knob removed, the frame sealed. She thought about what it would mean to run the length of a hallway toward a door that you remembered as a door. Night after night, at the same time, with the same urgency. Toward a door that was now a wall. She thought about this, and then she stopped thinking about it because there were things you could think about and things you could not think about and stay whole, and she had chosen to stay whole. She had made that choice deliberately, and she maintained it. But on the nights when she woke in the new apartment and lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of a new building, the sounds she did not yet know well enough to have categorized and filed and accepted as her own. On those nights, she thought about 4F and about the end of the hallway and about what it means when a place is the last place. When there is nowhere further to go. When the hallway ends and the wall is there and you hit it and it does not open and you hit it again. And again. And again. Because the door was there. You remember the door. You remember it was there.